Melania Trump revealed an unusual situation when she tried to board her own plane. What she discovered will surprise you. The setting sun cast a green light over the tarmac of West Palm Beach Airport, illuminating the immaculate white plane as it awaited its next takeoff. For Melania Trump, it was a routine flight. She approached the plane with her usual elegance, her cream dress gently billowing in the breeze. Her security detail kept a respectful distance, knowing her preference for quiet moments before a flight. As she approached the stairs leading to the plane, Melania noticed an unusual tension among the ground crew. They avoided eye contact, their movements hurried and uncoordinated. Something was wrong. Still, she kept moving forward, her instincts already on alert. At the bottom of the stairs was Paul Brennan, the pilot. Normally a confident and professional presence, Paul looked different that night. His rigid posture and nervous eyes indicated that something was out of the ordinary. "Good evening, Mrs. Trump," Paul said, his voice firm but lacking its usual calm. "Good evening, Paul," Melania replied, her voice polite but cautious. "Are we ready to go?" Paul hesitated, looking at the tablet in his hand. "Mrs. Trump, I'm afraid you cannot be allowed to board this flight." The words hung in the air, unexpected and disturbing. Melania paused, but maintained her composure. "Excuse me? I have orders," Paul continued, his voice lower, as if he feared being overheard. "You are not authorized to board this flight." Melania sank slightly, but her expression remained calm. "Orders from whom?" Paul looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Trump, I don't have all the details." "It's classified." Classified. The word carried a weight that made Paul flinch. Melania stepped closer, her footsteps echoing on the asphalt. "This is my flight. My trip. You will tell me who gave these orders and why." Paul held up his hand, palm outward, as if trying to physically stop her from advancing. "Mrs. Trump, please. This is not about you. This is for your safety." "Safety?" Melania repeated, her voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "And whose idea of safety involved keeping me out of my own plane?" Behind them, the crew stood frozen, their eyes flickering between Melania and Paul like spectators unsure of which side to take. The tension was palpable, amplifying every small sound, every distant engine, every whisper of the wind. "I need answers, Paul," Melania demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut through the heavy air. "And I need them now." Paul hesitated, his inner conflict evident. "Mrs. Trump, I'm just following orders," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Melania, her vision clear and determined, closed the distance between them. "Then you better tell me where those orders came from. Because this doesn't end here." Paul's silence spoke volumes. And in that moment, Melania knew this wasn't a simple delay. Something much bigger was at play, and she was determined to find out what it was. Melania Trump, her heels clicking firmly on the floor, took a step back, absorbing the absurdity of what she had just heard. Denied boarding her own plane without any real explanation? It was unimaginable. And here she was, staring at a man who had always been the epitome of professionalism, now reduced to a bundle of nerves, trapped in a web of secrets. "Paul," Melania said, her tone colder now, "you're making a huge mistake. If this is some kind of mistake, I suggest you fix it immediately." Paul looked down, as if expecting the ground to swallow him. "Mrs. Trump, please understand. This is not personal. I have been given direct orders and I cannot disobey them." Melania's patience was wearing thin. "Direct orders? From whom? My staff? The airline? Someone should explain to me why I'm being treated like a stranger on my own plane." Paul swallowed hard. "It's Adam's handle. I can't reveal more, ma'am. I'm just doing my job." Melania stepped forward, her presence commanding despite her smaller stature. "Your job is to fly this plane, Paul. So either you start doing that, or I will make sure this is your last flight." Paul stepped back, but kept his hands slightly raised, still physically blocking the way. "Mrs. Trump, I can't let you board." The tension between them was almost unbearable, and the crew behind them watched with chills down their spines. Melania pulled away, catching sight of the black car parked nearby. It hadn't been there when she'd arrived, and now it stood out like a silent specter. The sight made her stomach churn. Something wasn't right. Then she noticed something different. Two men in dark t-shirts stood near the nose of the plane, engaged in heated conversation. Their gestures were clear, their voices too low to be heard over the tarmac. They weren't part of the usual crew. She'd never seen them before. Who were they? And why were they there? "Paul," Melania said again, her voice cutting through the hot air. "If you think I'm going to walk away from here without answers, You don't know me well. Paul glanced nervously at the men in t-shirts, then back at Melania. Ma'am, I can't say anything more. Please return to the terminal. This is for your own safety. My safety? Melania's voice was clear now, her distrust evident. You think denying me access to my plane and hiding behind empty excuses is keeping me safe? You're lying to me, Paul. And I don't take kindly to liars. Paul's face contorted, his inner struggle visible for all to see. He lowered his voice, backing away a little. Mrs. Trump, I swear I don't want to do this. But there's more going on here than you realize. I'm following orders because I have no choice. There's always a choice, Paul, Melania retorted. And you're making the wrong one. Before Paul could respond, one of the men in t-shirts broke away from the conversation and walked quickly toward them. His expression was cold, his presence imposing. Captain Brennan, the man said, his voice distant and authoritative. We need a word now. Paul hesitated, glancing at Melania before giving in. The tall man in the t-shirt, with dark eyes that obscured his intentions, gestured for Paul to follow him a short distance away. Their conversation was muffled, but Melania caught words like classified and protocol, which only heightened her suspicions. Melania's cell phone rang in her hand, a call from her assistant. She answered quickly, her voice gruff. I'm being denied access to my plane. Find out who authorized this and get back to me immediately. As she hung up, her gaze returned to Paul and the man in the t-shirt. Paul looked increasingly uncomfortable, his arms crossed, his head shaking slightly in something that looked like reluctant agreement. When the man finally walked away, Paul returned, his face pale and his movements robotic. Mrs. Trump? Paul said, his voice even lower than before. Please, I'm begging you one last time. Go back to the terminal. And I'm telling you one last time, Paul, I'm not leaving without an explanation. Paul opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His hesitation spoke volumes, and Melania knew she had him cornered. Whatever he wasn't saying, whatever orders he was following, it was clear that this situation wasn't just about protocol. It was personal, and she wasn't about to back down. Paul Brennan felt his neck tighten as he stood frozen in front of Melania Trump. He had flown countless VIPs over his 2 decades as a pilot, but he had never experienced anything like this. The weight of his orders, the presence of mysterious agents, and the intensity of Melania's gaze combined to form a storm he could not escape. Paul had always prided himself on being a professional, but now he found himself questioning everything. The orders he had received that morning were vague but direct. Cancel the flight, deny access to passenger 1 under any circumstances, not reveal the reason, await further instructions from the agents on site. The email came from an unknown address, but the directives were reinforced by official language and the promise of severe consequences for disobedience. When he called the airline for clarification, he was put through to a government contact who confirmed the instructions. What worried him most was not the secrecy but the tone. There was no mention of technical problems, no explanation of possible threats, just a stern warning. For your safety, keep her off the plane. Paul's mind raced as he stared at Melania, standing firmly on the tarmac with the authority of someone who had spent years navigating high-stakes, high-power environments. She wasn't just angry, she was suspicious. And that suspicion was a ticking time bomb. He hesitated, his fingers fiddling with the card he held, as if the papers might offer some kind of recognition. They didn't. Mrs. Trump, Paul said carefully, you are not just a passenger. Your safety is paramount. And that is why these measures are in place. I can't say more, but I need you to trust that this is for the best. Melania's eyes narrowed. You keep saying this is for my safety, but you can't give me a concrete reason. Do you actually know why you're doing this? Or are you just following orders like a robot? Paul backed away. Her words hurt not because they were harsh, but because they were true. He didn't know why. He didn't know who had sent the orders or what they were protecting. All he knew was that his career, his reputation, and perhaps even his freedom were at stake if he disobeyed. He thought about his family, his wife, his 2 children, and the life he had built through years of hard work. Was he willing to risk all that? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his name. One of the agents, Agent Graham, approached with quick, deliberate steps. Captain Brennan, a word, Graham said, his voice dark and authoritative. Paul hesitated, then turned to Melania. Please, ma'am, wait here. Melania crossed her arms but didn't move. Her dark gaze followed Paul as he walked away with Graham. Captain, Graham began, his voice low. You're fine. Stick to the plan. Keep her off the plane and out of the loop. This is non-negotiable. Paul backed away. I understand, but I don't feel like I've been given enough information to deal with this properly. She's asking questions I can't answer, and it's only escalating. That's not your concern, Graham replied dryly. Your job is to follow orders, not question them. The less you know, the safer you'll be. Got it? Paul didn't answer right away. He looked back at Melania, standing near the stairs, her expression calm but determined, and then at the black SUV. The words "the less you know, the safer you'll be" echoed in his mind. What exactly was on the plane? Paul, what's on the plane? Melania asked, her voice firm. Paul looked at her, then at the plane, and back at Melania. He knew he was out of time to make a decision. He could continue following orders and live with the guilt of never knowing the truth, or he could stand up and risk everything. Paul Brennan walked back to the bottom of the stairs, the weight of Graham's words pressing down on his legs. He glanced at Melania Trump, who was now tapping her foot impatiently. Her frustration barely concealed her composed exterior. Every instinct screamed that the situation was far more dangerous than anyone was letting on. He simply didn't know how far this would go or how great the real danger was. Melania stopped tapping her foot when she saw Paul approach. Her eyes narrowed. Well, are you ready to explain what's really going on? Or should I keep guessing? Paul hesitated, his gaze shifting to the plane, then to the black SUV still standing ominously in the distance. He was caught between the orders he had been given and the growing realization that something was deeply wrong. Mrs. Trump, Paul began intently. I've done everything by the book my entire career, but now I don't know if following orders is the right thing to do. His expression softened, just a little, but his voice remained firm. Then do the right thing, Paul. Tell me what you know. Before Paul could respond, a low sound emanated from the direction of the plane. Melania and Paul turned simultaneously, their attention drawn to the cockpit. The plane's auxiliary power unit had activated, and the vibration in the air was unmistakable. Someone was preparing the plane for departure. Who's in the cockpit? Paul muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Melania didn't wait for an answer. She moved toward the stairs, her stride determined, but Paul stepped in front of her again, blocking her path. Mrs. Trump, wait, Paul said, his hands clenching at his sides. Wait for what? Melania snapped, her voice rising slightly. Someone is about to leave on my plane, and I'm supposed to just stand here and let it happen? Paul's hands tightened even more. Let me see what's going on first. He pulled away, his mind racing. Melania didn't move, but her eyes locked on him. You have 5 minutes, Paul. After that, I'll come over myself. Paul nodded quickly and climbed the stairs, his shoes clicking against the metal steps. When he reached the cockpit, he found the door closed. He knocked loudly, his voice firm. This is Captain Brennan. Open the door. For a moment, there was silence. Then the door opened wide enough for Paul to see a man's face, a face he didn't recognize. The man, disheveled and sweaty, looked at Paul with frightened eyes before quickly closing the door. Paul's heart sank. Whoever this man was, he wasn't part of the team. Paul knocked again, harder this time. Open the door now, or I'll break it down. Inside, he heard the man speaking rapidly, but the words were mumbled. Paul didn't wait for an invitation. He reached for the emergency transfer panel, entering the code that would grant him access. The door opened, and Paul stepped inside. What he saw stopped him cold. In the cockpit, the man from earlier sat in the co-pilot's seat. His hands shook as he held a tablet displaying encrypted messages. Behind him, strapped to the floor, was a large, unmarked crate. It was secured with reinforced locks. Its surface bore no labels or markings, save for an ominous emblem that Paul recognized immediately, the seal of a government agency. The man in the co-pilot's seat turned to Paul, his voice shaking. I didn't have a choice. They said I'd be safe if I just did what they told me. Paul stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. Who are you? And what's in the crate? The man lowered his head, tears streaming down his eyes. I can't. They'll kill me if I talk. You're already here, Paul said, his voice tense. Whatever's going on is already out of your hands. But if you tell me what's going on, I can help. The man hesitated, then looked at the crate. It's not just cargo, he said. It's evidence, files, recordings, everything they don't want the public to see. Paul held his breath, the implications sinking in. This wasn't about security or protocol. It was about hiding the truth. He turned to the man. And you? Why are you here? I'm the one who cracked it, the man admitted, his voice breaking. They caught me, but they need me alive to decrypt the files. If I don't go with them, the crate is useless. Paul felt a calm wash over him. He looked back at the crate, then at the man. We're not going to let this plane go, he said firmly. Stay here. He hurried down the stairs, where Melania was waiting. Her arms were crossed, her expression tense. What's on that plane? She demanded. Paul didn't mince words. Evidence. Enough to destroy some very powerful people, and a man who says they'll kill him if he doesn't cooperate. Melania's face darkened. They're using my plane to cover up a crime. Yes, Paul said. And we need to stop them before they do. The pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place, and the stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined. But the question remained. How far were they willing to go to ensure the truth came out? The air around the plane was thick, as if the tension of the situation had a physical weight. Paul Brennan stood at the base of the stairs, his mind racing. The revelation of what had been on the plane, the cockpit full of evidence, and the frightened man forced to transport it was more than he could process. But there was no time to hesitate. With every second the plane remained operational, the truth came closer to being erased. Melania Trump's voice cut through his thoughts like a knife. What do we do now, Paul? Her tone was calm but authoritative, making it clear that she wasn't asking for his opinion. She was demanding a solution. Paul glanced at the plane, then at the black car parked nearby. The agents inside were watching intently now, their silhouettes clearly visible through the tinted windows. His mind told him they weren't just there to monitor. They were there to ensure this operation was completed without interference. And if that meant silencing anyone who got in their way, Paul had no doubt they would do it. We need to stop this plane from taking off permanently, Paul said, his voice low but firm. If it takes off with the evidence and that man, they're as good as dead. Melania nodded, her expression determined. Then we'll stop him. But before they could act, the sound of car doors slamming caught their attention. Two men in dark t-shirts stepped out of the car. Their movements were abrupt and purposeful. Agent Wallace, the older of the two, led the way. His expression was a mask of barely concealed irritation. His younger partner, Agent Graham, followed closely behind, his posture tense and alert. Mrs. Trump, Wallace called, his voice carrying an air of forced politeness. I must insist that you leave the premises immediately. This situation is under federal jurisdiction, and your presence here is complicating things. Melania turned to face him, her posture tall. Complicating things? This is my plane, and I have every right to know what's going on it. Wallace's face twitched. Your right to know does not trump national security, Mrs. Trump. Please step aside, or I will be forced to remove you from the facility. Paul stepped forward, his voice firm but thick with defiance. You're not being honest, Wallace. There's no security threat here, is there? This is about hiding something you don't want anyone to find. Wallace's eyes narrowed. You're out of line, Captain, and you're out of excuses, Paul snapped. I saw what was in the cockpit. I know the evidence, and I know the man you locked in there. Graham winced at the mention of the man in the cockpit, but Wallace's expression remained impassive. You have overstepped your bounds, Captain Brennan. This is none of your business anymore. It became my business the moment you used my plane to transport something illegal, Paul replied. And I'm not letting this plane go. Wallace backed away, and for a moment Paul thought he might back away. But instead, the agent turned to Melania. Mrs. Trump, I strongly advise you to reconsider your actions. There are forces at play here that you cannot begin to understand. Melania didn't back down. What I understand is that you're hiding behind vague threats and secrets to cover up something you don't want the public to see. And I'm not going to back down from that. Wallace lowered his voice, leaning in slightly. You're making a mistake. If this plane doesn't leave, there will be consequences. For you. For him. He gestured to Paul. For everyone. Melania's eyes burned with determination. The only mistake here is thinking that I can be intimidated. As the standoff continued, Paul's mind worked furiously. He needed to act quickly before Wallace or Graham made their move. His eyes darted to the plane, then to the agents. Melania? Paul said quietly. We can stop this. How? She asked, her voice low enough that only he could hear. Paul stepped back a little. The fuel line. If I disconnect it, the plane won't be able to take off. Melania considered this for a moment, then gave a small nod. Do it. Paul moved quickly toward the fuel truck and stopped a short distance away. He grabbed a pair of pliers from the truck and began working on the plane's fuel line with practiced precision. Wallace and Graham screamed in protest, but Melania placed herself between them and the plane, her presence alone enough to keep them at bay. You're making a big mistake, Wallace shouted, his voice rising in frustration. Do you know what you're dealing with? Melania's calm voice cut through her scream. No, but I know enough to see through your lies. and I will make sure the truth comes out." Within moments, Paul had finished his work. He stopped and turned back, his hands covered in grease, but his expression resolute. "It's over. This plane isn't going anywhere." Wallace's face darkened with anger, but before he could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. Additional police cars and SUVs entered the tarmac, their lights casting a bright glow over the scene. Melania turned to Wallace, a subtle smile touching her lips. "Looks like we'll have a hearing for the truth after all." Paul took a deep breath, his heart pounding. The plane was grounded, but the battle was far from over. The evidence, the frightened man in the cockpit, the agents determined to keep their secrets, it all pointed to a much bigger fight ahead. And now, with the truth finally beginning to emerge, Paul and Melania knew they had crossed a line of no return, but neither of them was willing to back down. The cacophony of sirens grew louder as more vehicles arrived on the tarmac, their lights casting long, bright shadows behind the plane and into the surrounding area. Melania Trump stood firm, her neck straight, her expression a picture of calm defiance. She had spent years in the spotlight, navigating power struggles and intense scrutiny, but this moment was different. This wasn't about politics or appearances. It was about something much bigger. Paul Brennan stood beside her, his hands grease-stained from disconnecting the plane's fuel line, his breathing heavy. He had made his decision, one that would almost certainly cost him his career, but as he looked at Melania, he realized he was not alone. His resolve was unwavering, his presence a force that seemed to sustain the agents and their threats. Agent Wallace, visibly shaken, stepped forward again, his voice carefully controlled. "Miss Trump, you interfered with a federal operation. Do you have any idea what you just did?" Melania turned to face him, her blue eyes dark and unwavering. "What I did was stop you from abusing your authority. You used my plane to transport evidence and a prisoner, while lying to me about why you were being kept away. The only question that remains is, why?" Wallace's composure wavered for a second before he regained his composure. "You are out of your depth, Mrs. Trump. This is about national security. Your interference puts lives at risk. Don't insult my intelligence," she snapped, her voice cold. "You're not protecting lives. You're protecting secrets, secrets that could destroy powerful people. And you thought you could use my plane to cover it all up?" Paul couldn't help but admire her courage. She was standing up against men who had the weight of the government behind them, but she didn't back down. If anything, her defense only seemed to grow stronger. Out of the corner of her eye, Melania noticed the black SUV parked nearby. The driver's door opened, and another man stepped out, his face partially obscured by the glow of the flashing lights. He was tall, with a grim expression and the same air of authority as Wallace and Graham. His presence immediately raised the tension. "Who is he?" Melania asked, her voice firm. Paul followed his gaze. "Another agent, probably, or worse." The man approached with measured steps, his gaze fixed on Melania. When he spoke, his tone was calm but carried an unmistakable threat. "Mrs. Trump, I'm Special Agent Castillo. I've been briefed on the situation, and I'm here to make sure it doesn't escalate." Melania raised her hand. "You've already escalated, Agent Castillo. Your operation has been exposed. The police are here. This plane is not leaving." Castillo's lips curved into a thin smile. "You have created a spectacle, Mrs. Trump, but you have put yourself and everyone involved in a precarious position. What you have done here will have consequences, not just for you, but for everyone involved." Melania stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "That sounds like a threat, Agent Castillo." "That's a fact," Castillo replied. "You think you've stopped something by stopping this plane from leaving, but you've only delayed the inevitable. The evidence will still disappear. The man in the cockpit will be dealt with, and you'll find yourself answering questions you don't want to answer." Melania stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "If you think I'm afraid of you, you're wrong. I've faced threats greater than you and come out stronger each time. So go ahead, do your worst. But know this, the truth always comes out. Always." Paul watched the confrontation, feeling a mixture of awe and anxiety. He knew they were on dangerous ground, but he also knew Melania was right. The truth had a way of finding its way into the light, no matter how hard people tried to hide it. Behind them, the sound of car doors opening signaled the arrival of the police. Uniformed officers approached cautiously, their hands resting on their belts. The officer in charge, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward. "What's going on here?" she asked, her eyes darting between Melania, Paul, and the agents. Wallace quickly intervened, his voice low. This is a federal matter. We have it under control. The officer held up her hand. It's not what it looks like. We received a call about suspicious activity involving this plane. Would you like to elaborate? Before Wallace could respond, Melania spoke up. Officer, this plane was being used to transport evidence and a prisoner without proper authorization. These men are trying to cover it up, and when I confronted them, they threatened me. The officer's face twitched as she weighed Melania's words.